Welcome everyone to our live event tonight to talk us through the next steps of the PCS national campaign on pay, pensions and job security. I'm Martin Kavanagh, I'm acting president of PCS, and I'm very pleased to be joined tonight by our General Secretary, Fran Heathcote. Tonight's event is being live streamed across the various PCS social media channels on Facebook, on YouTube and on the X platform. And tonight gives you the opportunity to hear about the NEC decision taken last week to move to a consultation over the next 2 weeks with our members on the next phase of our national campaign. It also gives you the opportunity to ask questions and give us your views and comments and thoughts about a crucial stage of our campaign as we move forward. Before I move to introduce Fran, I just want to give a warm welcome to our BSL interpreter, Richard, who will be with us for all evening. And also a reminder to everyone, if you want to ask a question or send a comment, then please do so through our various social media channels. And make sure you tell us where you're calling from tonight. So tell us what your branch is, tell us your group, and tell us what your message and your question is. So without further ado, we're going to move straight to our first part of this evening's event. And I'm really pleased to introduce our newly elected General Secretary, Fran Heathcote.
Thanks very much, Martin, and good evening, everybody. And as Martin said, the purpose of tonight really is to try and get across quite a lot of information to you about the next stage of our national campaign. So just a quick recap, you'll recall that the NEC took the decision prior to Christmas to pause the industrial action of the campaign in order to allow talks to take place both at delegated level but also at a cabinet office wide level, and a number of meetings have taken place in both of those fora. So in particular, cabinet office meetings that have taken place have allowed us to make the case for low pay and for the fact that our members are suffering during a cost of living crisis and really deserve better. So you will be aware that the pause was something that was happening not just in PCS, but in a number of other unions as well that were in dispute. And clearly, it was always with a view to continuing the campaign and reballoting members at a stage where we felt that we had tested the negotiations, but perhaps hadn't got enough. So in terms of the national talks, they have been relatively positive, and in the longer term may lead to a change of approach around the delegated pay bargaining that we currently have and the way that pay is currently dealt with. And clearly our argument's all about what they call coherence and the idea, long held aim of the unions, I think, to have national pay bargaining as opposed to over 200 separate sets of talks taking place every single year. So the issues covered in the talks have been how we can use the remit guidance as an enabler and not just as a cap, how low pay and the impacts of the national living wage impacts on all the grades, but in particular on our lowest paid workers, the potential for any wins around terms and conditions, and a collective bargaining framework to take us forward in terms of pay coherence, but also in terms of equal pay. That simple idea that if you are doing broadly similar work, you should be paid the same amount of money as somebody doing that similar work in a different department. As a hangover really from the talks from 2023, there are 3 employer groups that are still to make good in terms of the concessions that were conceded last year. So of those 212 bargaining areas, we've whittled down now to just 3 who have yet to do the right thing. So in National Highways, talks are ongoing with the employer over their failure to pay the £1,500 lump sum. In National Museums Liverpool, the employers failed to pay the £1,500. Our members, you will probably be aware, are currently taking industrial action. So they are taking a programme of action that started on the 17th of February and runs right through to the 14th of April. So a big shout out to our National Museums Liverpool members who, as I say, are currently in dispute. And also you'll probably be aware of the pensions regulator members who, again, a big shout out to them. They've taken over 50 days of industrial action now because their employer has failed to pay the 4.5% available under the remit guidance to everybody else, offering a measly 3%. And it's clear that action, whilst it's having some impact as yet, to shift the employer. So we're in further discussions with them about next steps and further industrial action that's now due to take place there. So the talks that have taken place at the Cabinet Office level, as I say, have been sort of a combination of talks with the other public sector unions that are subject to the same remit, but also talks where PCS alone have been able to make the case for low-paid workers during a cost of living crisis. And of course, our issues are very slightly different to the other civil service unions. So that ability to have that discussion with the Cabinet Office about what the future might look like in terms of the coherence agenda, but also in terms of a degree of restoration. I'll come on to explain that in a little bit more detail. The Cabinet Office is on its 10th Minister of the Cabinet Office since 2015, and we had myself alongside the General Secretaries of the FDM Prospect met him last week, and again gave us a really good opportunity, in particular quite sensitive to the argument that we were becoming a minimum wage employer, and for many of our members that enforced uplift that we're seeing every April is unacceptable for government workers, and so it was a good opportunity to make our argument and get our case across. The reward strategy that the civil service has now adopted with the appointment of a new chief people officer now includes a section on the reward strategy, and the civil service people plan includes a segment all about how they're going to pay and retain their staff. So it is quite an important opportunity for us to influence all of that. It's also the case, of course, that this year there will be a general election. That is almost certain. Clearly, whilst we don't know who's going to win that general election, the timing of all of this is really important at a stage to be able to put pressure on both the minister who is currently taking on the job, but looking to the future, whoever forms the next government, making sure that we're at stage to be able to make the case for a decent pay rise at this point in time as well. You will probably be aware, if you've been following our comms, that there have been 2 pieces of academic research carried out. The first by Dr. Mark Williams from Queen Mary University of London, and that has produced some really key findings that will be very important to us workers in terms of using them for leverage before the government publishes its remit. The NEC will record, the NEC that met last week was given a fairly detailed breakdown of what the findings, the academic findings were, and what we intend to do quite quickly is publish that so that people can have sight of that. But it's worth reading that in a little bit of context. So I'll go through some of that in a little bit more detail. The report confirms what we always suspected, and that is that the living standard of civil servants has dropped significantly since 1979, with the drop since 2010 being far more pronounced and more acute, I suppose is the word I'm looking for. The report goes into some really detailed information around the pay claim. We can use it for the pay claim, we can use it for our bargaining strategy, but there's an awful lot in there that we can lift in terms of our campaign material as well. The second piece of academic research, which is underway at the moment, is why in the longer term, paying civil servants properly and paying government workers properly is good for the economy, and why that makes economic sense, whoever forms the next government. So that's something that obviously we'll want to use at the appropriate time. We have, the NEC agreed the elements that would form this year's national pay claim, and indeed our claim has gone into the Cabinet Office, but also to the delegated employers on Friday, alongside notification of a proposed trade dispute, again firstly to the Cabinet Office, but then obviously to every employer covered by the national campaign. And for all those reasons, it's obviously really important that we make sure that pay is a key element. It remains the key element of our campaign. What became clear in that academic research is, as I say, it's a little bit nuanced and it means different things for different grades of workers. But the figures that we're looking at here are between 11% and 62% by the amount that our civil servants have fallen behind, our members have fallen behind over the course of a number of years of pay restraints. So there's really important propaganda that we can use, but clearly it's important that we use that in the correct way, that we use that in our negotiations with delegated employers, but that we also use that to make the case for fair pay. On the cost of living rise, we obviously want to make sure that any increase that's negotiated is inflation above inflation. So it must be an inflation-proof pay increase, but it must also take account of what we would describe as restoration. So the fact that we have the stats now that back up that the pay has fallen behind by such a significant amount means that we'll be able to use that to really good effect in terms of influencing the remit. And that's why the timing of all this is so important. So obviously when the announcement was made that we would pause the campaign, clearly there was some concern that this meant the NEC had abandoned the campaign, that the campaign had somehow disappeared. But anybody who listened to the NEC reports or read the paperwork that came out at that time would understand that this was only ever a pause and that we needed branches to be geared up and ballot ready. So of course the next stage of the campaign will be very much about taking a temperature check in terms of where our members are. So you'll remember that whilst we made significant gains on pay, that still remains the really important focus of our campaign. But in addition to that, we did get concessions around the civil service compensation scheme, and that is that the manifesto commitment from the government to slash that by 33% has now gone away, certainly for the life of this government, which means that the elements of the campaign that remain are pay, pensions, and as Martin said, job security. On pensions, we'll be in the Supreme Court of Appeal. We'll be in the Court of Appeal tomorrow. The case starts tomorrow for our appeal, given the long-standing campaign we've had to try to get back the 2% that we're all overpaying at the moment in terms of our pension contributions. So that unifying factor that affects all of us is going to be really important in the campaign going forward. So whilst pay will affect different groups and different employer groups differently, the pensions issue affects everybody covered by the campaign. And then thirdly, that element around job security and making sure that we seek wherever possible guarantees around job security and no compulsory redundancies becomes really important when you look at some of the statements that the Tories are making. They're making a bit of scorched earth policy at the moment, aren't they, where they're trying to attack as much as they can in the time they've got left. And so that remains an important element of our campaign. So the trade dispute, as I say, has been notified today to the Cabinet Office, but also to the delegated employers, and very quickly guidance will be going out to all delegated negotiators in order to take forward the elements that we need to, the arguments that we need to make, if you like, to the employer. In addition to that, this temperature check, which starts tomorrow, will be, it's not really a consultative ballot as such, it's an electronic exercise to ask members to sign up to some basic issues that we're putting forward. So the questions will be: do you agree that we should campaign over the issues? Do you support PCS's pay demands for 24-25? Would you be prepared to take strike action in order to achieve them? And would you be prepared to contribute to a levy in order to do so? The one slightly different element to all of this is Scottish sector, where, of course, they have already secured a 2-year deal on pay, and they have already secured some commitments around job security. So the only unifying issue for the Scottish sector members will be the pensions issue. So there will be a separate consultation taking place with them to make sure that we are, asking the right questions, but also that people want to be part of the campaign. The temperature check, or the consultative stage, ends on the 5th of March. The NEC meets on the 6th of March, and it'll be at that point that they would need to take stock of the feedback we've had and decide whether we move to a statutory ballot. The statutory ballot, if we decide to go ahead with it, assuming that our position is strong and that we haven't had we've had a negative response from the employer, which I think is fairly likely, we would then move to a timetable for a statutory ballot, which would serve notice to the employer on the 8th of March. The ballot would open on the 18th of March and close on the 13th of May. That timetable would give us some leverage with the pay remit guidance that's about to be published, usually at the end of March, would give us 8 weeks to deliver turnouts that can beat the ballot threshold, and would give us the ability, based on the result that comes from all of that, to debate all of that at conference, which would be meeting the following week. And it would give the argument that we should push this back into the long grass and delay would completely miss the boat in terms of being able to influence that pay remit guidance, which is why it's been so important in terms of our messaging that we've always made the argument that we would need to remain ballot ready and members would need to be prepared for the next stage of the campaign. So in conclusion, Martin, I've been through quite a lot of detail there, and I realise it's quite a lot to take in, and that the consultative stage would start fairly quickly. But what we intend to do between now and certainly the time that the NEC meets on the 6th of March is produce a lot of material, a lot of support and guidance. There will be further reps and activist events to make sure that people understand the campaign, that everybody's geared up for what happens next, and to take the opportunity to be able to put pressure on both the Cabinet Office but on the government ultimately in time to be able to influence the pay remit. If we miss that boat, if we don't take that opportunity, by the time we would be looking at a ballot post-conference, the remit guidance would be out there, the ship would have sailed, and we'd be very much in a position of not being able to have influence in terms of our campaign. Speaking to other public sector unions that are also in dispute over similar issues, the NEU in particular in a similar position. There are a number of other unions that are now looking at the next stage of their campaigns, and one of my early tasks when I take up my seat on the General Council will be to work closely with those other unions to make sure that we have as big a coordinated campaign as it's possible to muster. So I'm going to leave it there for now. I appreciate that I've said rather a lot, but there's also rather a lot to say, and people will have all sorts of questions and comments. So very happy to take all of them, Martin.
Okay, that's great. Thanks very much, Fran. And you're right, it certainly generated a whole load of questions and comments that I'll start feeding through in just a second. Just before we do, just a reminder, everyone, that obviously the whole point of tonight is to try and get as wide a reach as we possibly can across the PCS membership. So please share the link across the various social media platforms on your Facebook. If you've got other social media account, Instagram, get it shared so we can get as wide a reach as we possibly can. And also keep the comments and questions coming. Just a gentle reminder to let us know if you are given a question or comment. Just let us know who you are, which branch you're from, and which group you're from as well. So the first set of questions, Fran, really are around this whole topic of ballots and whether it's consultative or where we're going next, potentially with statutory. So there's two or three which I'll give you to start with. The first one is from Ruth from HMRC, and it is, why are we being consulted again after being consulted last year rather than just being balloted for strike action? Second question is, it's easy to result on a consultative ballot. Well, how will you translate this to success in a statutory ballot? And that's George from HMRC. And then finally, what support will there be for recruiting new members to increase the effectiveness of the national campaign? And again, that's HMRC, and it's from Chloe.
Okay, well, look, thank you, all three of you, for those questions, because they're just the sort of considerations that the NEC had to make last week. So in terms of why we're consulting again, as I said in my presentation, this is very much a temperature check. We have to be conscious of the fact that, you know, there is a fair amount of negative communications going on after the decision to pause the action. And it may well be that people believed some of the rhetoric that we were abandoning the campaign. So before we move immediately to a statutory ballot, we need to be in the best position to win that statutory ballot. And by that, I mean to beat the 50% threshold. So the whole purpose of the temperature check is to give us an opportunity and give you an opportunity to engage as many members as possible, to gear up for what's about to happen, to make the case for the issues that we're dealing with, why we're dealing with pay, pensions and job security, how the campaign so far has made some gains in terms of the civil service compensation scheme, hence why that's no longer a demand, that the strategy up till now has been endorsed by 90% of the membership, and it's absolutely essential that we keep members on board at every stage and that we test all of that, so that when the NEC makes the decision on the 6th of March, hopefully to press the button on a statutory ballot, people aren't going in cold and people have had that time to engage, to share the communications, which there will be much of, and to make sure that members know what's coming and what we're gearing up for. In terms of the second question, which is around, it's all very well saying we'll have a consultative ballot, but how do you translate that to a statutory ballot? Hopefully what I've just said has answered that to some extent, in as much as it's really our ability to engage every single member, for members to understand the campaign, to understand why it's important, recognising that not every member has given us their contact details. We need to make sure that we've got as much information as possible to give to members, but also our ability to communicate with them. So it's a very, very good question. You know, it's not a given, is it, that just because we get a good feedback in a consultative ballot, that's going to translate to us winning on a statutory ballot. So we've had all sorts of discussions at the NEC about what form the ballot would take, you know, why the pros and cons of how we would ballot members and the length of any ballot. But I think the overwhelming conclusion is, in order to have the maximum impact on the government and the Cabinet Office in a general election year, recognising that if we don't do this now, we will miss the boat in terms of the remit, but it will also put us in a weaker position in terms of making our case to any incoming government. It was important that we have this warm up, we have this temperature check, for want of a better phrase, but then quickly that becomes a statutory ballot where we ask members to commit in writing, using a postal ballot, which is the only way we can run a statutory ballot, to the demands that PCS are making. And that last point around recruitment and how can we use the campaign to recruit, everything that we have discussed around the national campaign has been with one eye on building the union, because clearly if you're going to have any sort of campaign, one of the key aims is to build union strength, build union power, and have the ability to put the maximum pressure on the employer. So we have a lot of organising staff who are allocated to branches and who are tasked with working with branches to make sure that they're not just ballot ready in terms of gearing their members up around the messaging, but that also they are using that as an opportunity to recruit. And I think it's really, really important that we have that approach in terms of everything we're doing, every bit of communications, with a view to not just people who are already in the union, but potential members, and how the campaign may encourage more people to join, which in turn makes us stronger. All the historic evidence shows that when we're part of a campaign and members feel engaged with that, union membership climbs. But we need to make sure that we do all the groundwork to ensure we maximise our recruitment opportunities. There's three really good questions there, Martin, that started us off.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks very much, Fran. Okay, the next sets really are around sort of specific elements of the campaign and in terms of our demands. So the first question is from Colin in DWP, and that what happens to our pensions claim if we are successful in court? Julia from the MOJ, I think you've already answered this to a degree, Fran, but just for clarity, what does pay restoration mean?
Yeah.
And then finally, Charlie from DWP, why don't we all have the same contracts, pay and terms and conditions across the civil service?
Yeah, okay. Okay, so in terms of the pensions and the success in court, our strong view is that if we win in the court next week, or tomorrow, in fact, the case starts, the government is likely to appeal and to go to the Supreme Court. The consequence of that means we probably won't have an outcome on pensions this side of a general election. So there was a debate at the NEC about whether we include pensions in our demands, recognising that it's unlikely that we will conclude the issue of pensions anytime soon. But because it's such a unifying issue, because it impacts on so many of us, and people understand the inherent unfairness of us all overpaying our pension contributions, it was felt that we need to keep pressure on pensions. But if the legal advice for us is good, it's a good chance we may well win next week. The likelihood is, sorry, my light's just gone out, I've gone into darkness here. The likelihood is that the employer, the Cabinet Office and the government would likely appeal that decision, which would push any final decision back beyond a general election. In terms of restoration, and what does restoration mean? If you look, when the analysis is published that's been produced by the academic, what that indicates is how much we have fallen behind. But of course, it's different by grade. And whether this is surprising or not, senior civil servants are shown to have fallen behind by 62%. So do we make a pay claim for 62%, arguing that that's what some members have lost? I think that would probably look unrealistic to a number of members, and they would find it hard to understand. But there's a danger that by placing a figure on this and giving the message that we want 10% or we want £15 an hour or whatever that sort of exact figure is, that in a way limits our options in terms of our campaigning. So restoration is the ability to have those negotiations with the government and the employer to say, of course, we want an inflation-proof pay rise, but in addition to that, we want some redress for everything that's gone before. Now, it may be that we're able to agree, or maybe not agree, but come to some sort of arrangement around partial restoration this side of a general election, but giving us the ability to continue to make the arguments for restoration after a general election with any incoming government. And clearly none of us have a crystal ball, but in terms of it being a different government, we may well be able to have an ongoing campaign around restoration. So restoration is a really important element of what we're asking for. But it would be, I think, probably wrong to place a figure on it, because the figure you place on it would skew the money towards the highest paid, because the academic evidence demonstrates that it's the highest paid that have lost out by the greatest percentage. So I think because we represent all grades and all of our members, we want to make sure that we're able to make that argument around restoration, but recognising, of course, that we also want a cost of living increase in terms of any of this. In response to Charlie's question, why don't we have national pay bargaining? Why don't we have one rate of pay for the civil service? Wouldn't that be a good idea? And isn't that what we've been, has been a long-standing aim, I suppose, of PCS for as long as I've been a member of PCS and its predecessors. But of course, you will recall that when the government moved to delegated pay bargaining, it wasn't an accident. It was the very intention of breaking up the ability for all of us to have one rate of pay. What we think we might have are some good legal challenges in terms of the fact that there will be people in different departments doing broadly similar work, getting very different rates of pay. But of course, we can't rely entirely on the courts to win our campaign for us. And clearly, whilst there are really good arguments to be made, and these discussions we've had with the Cabinet Office have given us the ability to go in there and make the case for what we call pay coherence. And coherence, it's nothing, to put it very simply, it is that idea that we have less delegation, more bringing together of all the different pay rates and the different grades, and that there's an ability to see progression, whatever grade you're at, in a reasonable length of time. So the coherence argument is very much around the case for national pay and the fact that it's a nonsense, isn't it? If they want to talk about waste and bureaucracy, that you have over 200 sets of negotiations taking place every single year that set members against each other, give people very different rates of pay. So I hope that answers those, Martin.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks very much, Fran. And comrades are sending in questions that a lot of them are very specific to groups and group negotiations. So what we are going to do is we are making a note of all of the questions and are group specific, and we will endeavour to make sure that the group and the union nationally will provide written responses to all of those questions as well, rather than fire them tonight where we might be able to give an answer, because they are very, very specific to individual groups. But there are a couple. This isn't so much to do with the demands, Fran, but there are a number of comments and questions coming in around about the 60% return to the office. So I think it might be worth touching on that. The first one is from Andrew from the Home Office, and what is happening about the 60% return to the office is that in the pay claim? And then the second one is, what will PCS do to push back on the 60% office attendance, taking away the flexibility that workers have had? So that's from Jack.
Okay, yeah, really good questions, and obviously a hot topic at the moment. So the decision was taken not to include the 60% return to office in what are civil service wide demands, because it differs so much by department, and certainly some of the bigger departments are indicating that even if they wanted to, they wouldn't have the ability to get all our members back into the office 60% at the time. It's one of those arbitrary figures that the Tory minister threw about without any real concept of how that can work in reality, and it's something that is being debated with the Cabinet Office at a civil service wide level, in addition to the talks that are going on in the various departmental groups. So as Martin said, some of this will be down to your individual GC and your employer group and what the employer is saying. But in terms of the 60%, we are making the case centrally that it's a nonsense, that I think, as Andrew indicated, we need to push back on it, because for so many people, there is absolutely no sense to it. Why would you bring people who don't need to be in office into a workplace where there isn't enough room for them to do work that could be done at home? But of course, the other side of that is we will have members that have been coming into the workplace all the way through the pandemic and beyond. And it does mean very different things for different people and for different groups of workers. That's why it's not a unifying demand, and that's why it's not a demand that forms part of the campaign, the national campaign. But it is very much, as I say, a hot topic, and one that we are pushing back quite hard on at Cabinet Office level, but recognising, as I say, that it does mean different things to different employer groups. And so there, in addition to the talks that we're involved in centrally, there are lots and lots of delegated talks taking place with GCs about what this means. And we will make sure that guidance comes out, both in terms of what we've negotiated centrally, if anything at all. I think at the moment, the Cabinet Office is scratching their heads a bit about how any of this could possibly work in reality, but I'm aware that in a lot of departmental groups there are quite a lot of discussions ongoing there too. So that's why it's not a national campaign demand, because it would be quite hard to make a unifying demand that applied to everybody in all of the different employer groups. But it is important that the issues are taken up, and I think Andrew makes the point that there's not a lot of logic to what is being proposed in some cases, and we need to make sure that all of that is fed into the talks that are taking place. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Fran. Okay, there are three questions now really around organising, and in particular getting members up for the ballot if we move to statutory ballot. So the first one is from Kate, and that is, I feel we're at risk of getting little or nothing this year. The right-wing media have already laid the ground for civil service to get a bashing in the culture wars, and we're an easy target. How are we going to stand up for ourselves? The second question is, every month when I check branch reports, we lose members due to the cost of PCS membership. What can PCS do to stop the exodus of members? That's from Mark. And then finally, Fran, I think you'll heard this once or twice at the NEC, but in the MOJ group, there are currently a lot of moribund and inactive branches. What is the best thing reps based in the workplaces can do to ensure turnout and engagement with the campaign when their branch structures are currently not active? And that's from Matthew.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Martin. So the key to, the crux of all of this is what we're going to do about it, isn't it? How are we going to engage members in the time that we've got? And I think the first point about how do we stand up for ourselves that Kate made is a really, really important one. It's quite clear, isn't it, to anybody that we don't necessarily have the same public sympathy as a nurse will have, for example. So often, there's been quite a lot of right-wing propaganda already around civil service pay in 2024. And so that's why the campaign becomes so important. What's clear is they aren't going to pay up unless they have to, unless they feel some pressure from all of this. So clearly there will be a lot of work going on with branches and with groups to make sure that every branch has got a plan in place for how to engage members. And I mean, it can be quite simple things in terms of making sure we've got contact details for everybody, that we're dealing with the invalid ballot addresses, so where people perhaps are getting post-return because they don't live where they said they did, then whilst the figures are moving in the right direction and groups are working really hard to try and reduce some of that, making sure that our sort of membership records are up to date, our staff and post figures are accurate, the branches are working on a bit of a plan about how they engage everybody, is going to be really key in the weeks ahead, and we want to give you as much support with that as possible. So if you are in a branch where you feel that actually you could do with some organised support, don't keep that to yourself. Get in touch either via your group or in touch directly with the organising department, and we will put you in touch with somebody who can help with all of that. In terms of this issue around the cost of membership and losing members, I mean, clearly we remain quite competitive in terms of union membership compared to other trade unions, but recognising that in a cost of living crisis where every penny counts, then clearly people do worry about being able to afford the subscriptions. But I think if you look at the figures in terms of what we achieved through the campaign that has run to date, it is quite sort of notable that as a result of the campaign, AAs received on average a 7.5% increase in 2023, AOs 6.5%, and EOs an average of 5.5%. So all of those figures are significantly more than had we not had the campaign. And I think we have to put some of this around cost and affordability into that context in terms of what's been achieved by the campaign so far, recognising that there's still an awful lot more to do, but that in fact, being a member of the union, being part of the campaign, it is really, really important. And so therefore we want as much emphasis to go on why people should be in the union, why they should stay in the union. And I recognise that sometimes those are quite difficult arguments to have with people, but clearly the alternative is not being in a union, not being part of the campaign, and the union as a result being less effective, which of course is not going to help anybody get better pay. So, there's no doubt that the government have made some bold statements around public sector pay, but in particular around civil service pay. It's clear that there will be propaganda arguments going on about why we're undeserving of a cost of living increase, and our job is to engage members, but also to tackle that in as best we can. In terms of the point around moribund branches and how we engage members, I mean, it's very, very simplistic for me to say organise and talk to every single member, but that is really what we're up against, isn't it? If we have members that are not in branches that are well organised and don't have people going out there giving them the information, how do we ensure that those members feel part of the campaign and feel engaged? So I'm aware that in the MOJ, where this is a particular concern, there have been quite a lot of work between the group organiser and the PCS organising department to address some of that. But again, if there are issues that people think would be suitable for a bespoke piece of work around the MOJ in terms of some of those moribund branches, but also in terms of members that don't have a rep or don't have a voice in their workplace. And also, it's not just the MOJ, is it? There's lots and lots of people that predominantly don't work in a workplace at the moment, and we need to have a real focus on how we engage them and how we make sure that every single member is communicated with. So, on the organising stuff, there are reams of plans being put in place by the organising department in terms of contacting every branch, contacting every member, and doing some of the basics around workplace engagement and making sure that we've got a way of communicating with absolutely everybody. I know in some regions there's been quite a focus on payday activities. So if you take the region here, London and South East, they have had a lot of activity focused on payday when people realise what they're not getting, and there has been suitable campaign events put on to sort of to tackle some of that. But in different regions and different areas and different employer groups, people will deal with that all differently. There is some effort to try and provide additional training, whether that's strike schools for reps and activists, whether it's just better engagement around the aims of the campaign. Certainly, I've been discussing today whether there's the ability to have an all-activist forum where we could get lots and lots of people onto a call to a combination of putting forward the arguments from the National Executive Committee in a bit more detail than I've done tonight, but also some quite practical stuff about how branches work with the organising department to tackle some of that, how we can use Salesforce and some of the technology that we've now got to input the details about who's participating, who's voting. So there's a lot in that organising question, and it's something that we're acutely aware of in terms of trying to make sure that people are as ready and as geared up as they can be for a statutory ballot, because it's not just about having industrial action, is it? It's about winning the 50%, beating the threshold in order to get there. And of course, a strong message to the employer and the government is if we're able to do that. And not so good messages if we aren't able to beat the threshold. So it's in all of our interests to engage every single member as best we can. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Fran. And the next three questions really are grouped together around pay and specifically low pay.
Yeah.
So the first one is from Sharon. Yet again, in DWP, they will be paid the absolute minimum any employer in the UK has to legally pay an employee. It's this percentage malarkey that has put us in this position. The bottom grades need a proper pay rise. So it is more of a comment than a question, but I think a valid one to respond to. The second one from Paula is that AOP has in practice become nationally negotiated, hasn't it? Because the national living wage is driving the rate members are paid. It's a disgrace, and our members deserve pay restoration. And then finally, within the MOJ group last year, pay negotiators were served up a take it or leave it as a fait accompli. This led to some members based with MOJ to question what the benefit of pausing for them was, but also about their union membership. What would be the best thing to say to reassure members who might be concerned that the same thing on low pay will happen again? And that's from Matthew.
Okay, thanks, Martin, and thanks for the three questions, because again, there's quite a good mix there. In terms of it, of course, it isn't just DWP, but I recognise that this is a big issue in DWP around the sheer volume of members that fall below the national living wage every April. It's also a big issue in the HMRC. So our two biggest groups in particular have tens of thousands of members now falling below the national living wage. And I think it was Sharon that asked that first question. And Sharon's absolutely right. It is completely unacceptable. So when I met the Minister for the Cabinet Office last week, I was able to use that as that you don't get very long with ministers and you need to focus your contribution about what are the key points. And I was able to use that as a real example of what being a minimum wage employer is like in the civil service. And of course, he was a little bit taken aback that to hear the civil service described as a minimum wage employer, but it had the ability then to explain the cost of living crisis, what it means, the number of our members on in-work benefits, the number of people who are using food banks, and there's some very heart-wrenching stuff around the messaging around low pay. So being part of this campaign is our best chance of being able to put pressure on to do something about that, because the alternative to being part of this campaign is that when April comes this year and in future years, we will just once again see tens of thousands of members falling below the national living wage, and that's unacceptable, but it will continue to be unacceptable. As I say, the government won't address this unless they have to, unless there's a real concerted effort for us to pull together and address these issues. The points around AOP, and whilst I don't know which department they come from, I think this is a unifying argument in a lot of our departments now, is this why pay restoration has to be such a big element of what we're demanding. So of course we want an inflation-proof pay rise, that goes without saying. But in addition, we must address this issue of restoration, this idea that we have literally, and the academic research completely backs it up, we have literally fallen behind by tens of thousands of pounds and huge percentage figures because of their inability to, or unwillingness rather, to address pay. And it's led, it's not an exaggeration to say it's led to a broken system, to a system where we see regular leapfrogging, where people come into into an employer department and overtake people who are already there, because of the nonsense that has been created by delegated pay bargaining and this sort of multi-tier workforce that they have created. So of course they need to do something about the national living wage, but they need to do something about the whole grade structure as well. You know, it was a fact that in the two biggest departments this year, those bottom grades were virtually merged this year because they were all below the national living wage, and that's seeping into the EO grade now, because it's getting worse all of the time. So really, really important arguments to make, and again, a good reason to be part of the campaign. On the MOJ point, and I think a lot of this will come down to messaging and having clear messaging that engages members around why this is an issue for them. So we will, of course, put out an awful lot of comms, but that will be comms aimed at making the national arguments around all of this. In addition, I think what groups are able to communicate with their members around issues that affect them. So that example of in the MOJ, how many people just felt completely, let down by the pay system, means that there is a need for us to work with groups to ensure that their comms are right as well. So of course we're going to have a lot of national communications, but by their nature they'll be quite generic. And in addition, what's required is a really good comm strategy in groups. So one of the things that's going out to group negotiators tonight is a set of guidance around the sorts of issues they need to engage the employer on, but also, of course, the sort of communications and the messaging to members around why the campaign is so important in their group. So tonight won't be the beginning and the end of all of this. I think there will be a lot of communications and engagement with all of you over the weeks ahead. I would urge you to do everything you can in the time we've got to, take this temperature check. Obviously, what would be not very helpful is if the overwhelming response from the consultation is that people don't care about their pay or their pensions or their job security. So we need levels of engagement. We need members to get on board with responding to that. It's very, very easy to do. It's going to be electronic, and it will be the ability to just say yay or nay, I agree or I don't, in terms of what the union is proposing, and I'd be prepared to take action to support all of that. The hard bit then will be, of course, making sure that we engage enough people to win a statutory ballot and beat the 50% threshold for as many members as possible. So that hopefully deals with those, Martin.
Yeah, that's great, Fran. There are now 3 quite specific questions, really. There are individual questions, but they are about, again, the terms of the demands. I think we've probably got just about enough time to do them. The first one is from Beth, and that is, how will the part of the pay claim which refers to reduction of working week fit in with existing campaigns that are already taking place? What is the attitude of the other civil service unions to civil service pay 24-25? And then finally from Carl, that's from Kevin, and then finally from Carl from DFT, can we try to ensure that whatever we can force out of the employer as a pay increase, it is consolidated rather than non-consolidated?
Yeah, okay, that's great, thank you. Okay, so on the pay claims around the working week, we already have good examples of where negotiations have been very positive around the issues of the working week, and we don't want to do anything that's going to cut across those positive talks that are already taking place. So, for example, in the Scottish sector, in DEFRA, in ONS, and in some other employer groups, there are already positive discussions about what a reduction in the working week might look like. In other parts of the civil service. So again, this is one of the issues with delegated bargaining, where everything's a little bit different depending on who your employer is. This will be a fairly new demand and a new concept to try and communicate across. So what we will do is issue central guidance. The National Disputes Committee Secretary is on hand to work with groups and to work with negotiators to make sure that we join up our messaging, but also that we reflect the different position that different employers may take in terms of all of this. So whilst it may be that they limit the increase in monetary terms, there may be other stuff that we can do around some of these issues around reduction in the working week and some of the other benefits. So it's always worth having a pay claim that includes elements like that, recognising that different employers will be at different stages of those discussions. On the attitude of other civil service unions, so I suppose the ones we deal the most with are Prospect and the FDA. And it is clear that from the meeting that the three general secretaries had with the minister last week, all three unions are incredibly angry at the way that civil servants have been treated. The detail will come in terms of what members in those constituent unions are prepared to do about it. So whilst, you can be as angry as you like, can't you? The next stage that we would always consider is, are we in a position to be able to take action and to be able to push back on what the government and the Cabinet Office are proposing? And that will be a matter for those individual unions to decide in terms of whether they move to industrial action. As I say, there was no difference between the three unions in terms of the actual anger that was being felt by what the government and the Cabinet Office were doing or not doing to address what are really key issues for all three unions. But the judgment for each union will be what's the best way of pushing forward on our demands, and are we in a position to take action that would advance those demands. So when we have a little bit more detail in terms of we've got ongoing meetings with the Cabinet Office. The next one's scheduled for the 29th of February, and that will be a meeting with the other trade unions, not just for PCS, and we will use that as an opportunity, I think, to sort of test out where some of those other unions are. On Carl's point, and it's a point well made, Carl, obviously our starting point, our bargaining position on anything like this is for consolidated increases, without a doubt. If they're not consolidated, they're only worth what they're worth on the day that you get them, and clearly we want as much as possible of what we're achieving to be consolidated, don't we? The difficulty is how we insist that happens, and again, it will come down to the strength of our campaign. If we're able to put enough pressure on both employers and the Cabinet Office in terms of only accepting consolidated increases, that'll be down to what membership strength we're able to demonstrate. So that really is why we have to pull together as best we can now, send a good message in terms of the temperature check, so that the NEC can make clear decisions when it meets on the 6th of March, and then, all being well, we can move to a statutory ballot in time to be able to influence the pay remit, which in turn will put pressure not just on the current government, but on any incoming government later in the year when there's a general election. So if you listen to all the pundits, there are arguments being made for a general election being as early as May, but there are others saying it's likely to be the autumn. Whenever that takes place, we need to be in a position to be able to influence not just our current government, but whoever forms the next one. And the best way of doing that is having a strong, united campaign. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Fran. And I think it is perhaps just, there's a couple of, one question and one comment where I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding. So I think it is important to finish off on these 2 points. First of all, in terms of the question, what have we been offered for 24-25? I think that may have been somebody who came in and missed at the start of your contribution earlier on. But then the final point, it's more of a pointer or an observation rather than a question, Fran. But it's from Carl, and it's my frustration was that the union gave up on 22-23. They just didn't tell anyone. I think there were 2 misunderstandings that needs probably responded to.
Okay, thanks, Martin. Okay, so on the first point, we haven't been offered anything yet, because the process that we go through is the union makes a claim, which is what has happened with us on Friday. We put our claim in, and the government and the Cabinet Office produce what they call a pay remit, and that pay remit governs what employers are able to offer in this year's pay round. The pay remit is anticipated to be the 31st of March. Now, whether it will actually happen on the 31st of March will largely, I would suggest, be down to what we decide to do in the next 3 weeks. So the best chance we have of influencing the remit, but also making sure that the remit isn't just used as a way to limit civil service pay, but in fact that we use the remit as a bit of an enabler in terms of what they might be able to do to achieve greater pay coherence. So that deals with hopefully, what we've been offered. I mean, if you read the press, there's all sorts of suggestions coming from civil service world and other places that there will be very, very limited and low offers in this year's pay round. But the reality is, until the remit guidance is produced, and that's likely to be the end of March, we don't know. And our task is to put as much pressure on in advance of them publishing the remit guidance. It's no good then starting a campaign once the remit guidance is out there, because what you'll get is employers, settling on this or imposing on this before we've had a chance to influence. So the key to this is the timing of it and making sure that we are geared up in time to have an impact on the remit guidance when it's published. And to address, I think it was Carl, but whoever said the frustration was that the union gave up, I think that is probably a bit of a misrepresentation of what happened. The NEC was very, very clear that it intended to pause the action, and we did that for a number of reasons, which I think were well rehearsed at the time. But that pause was then endorsed by 90% of the membership who voted to endorse the strategy. So that was an overwhelming endorsement, really, for the strategy that was being put forward. It was never the end of the campaign. It was never giving up on what we had, but it was recognising that we needed to assess what had been offered and imposed in various employer groups. So, you will have employer groups that met or came very close to meeting all of the demands on pay, and you'll have other employer groups that were nowhere near. I think in most employer groups there was more money than had they not taken the action, and the judgment is always what would happen if we'd taken more action. The judgment at the NEC at the time was that the pause was the right thing to do. It allowed those delegated talks to be assessed, all 200 odd bargaining units. It allowed us to get into a negotiation with the Cabinet Office, both in terms of the NTUC, so the number of civil service unions that meet together with the Cabinet Office, but also making PCS-specific arguments around the issues of low pay, and then to be in a position to be able to move to further industrial action at a stage when that is likely to have the most impact. So if you listen to the communications, or you read the communications that were produced in December, they were very much around people making sure they were ballot ready, making sure that they were in a position to move to action at the appropriate time. We have allowed, I would suggest, significant time for the talks with the Cabinet Office to take place. And as I said, if you missed the beginning, they have made some progress, and it's clear that in the longer term there is some thought being given to how we can achieve greater coherence, but nothing that we've heard, I think, would be enough to say that's the dispute settled, that's all our aspirations on pay dealt with. Far from it. And so, the next stage now has to be to put pressure on at a time when we can have as much impact as possible on the remit that they're about to publish. And not to do that means that we would really miss the boat for 2024 if we don't do that in the time scale that I've set out. So I hope that helps. I hope that clears things up a little bit. There was never any intention of the union giving up, but it was correct, in my opinion, certainly, that we paused the action to take stock, which we've now done. We now have a clear picture, both in terms of delegation, but in terms of the civil service wide talks that have taken place, and that allows us now to go to the employer with clear demands about what we're expecting for 2024, the flexibility to be able to use the academic research to make the arguments around restoration alongside an inflation-proof pay increase will give us, I think, the ability to influence not just the government that we're sitting in front of today, but the one that's likely to come to power later on in the year. And as I say, I don't have a crystal ball in terms of exactly when that will be, but we need to put ourselves in the best position to deal with all of that. So I hope that clarifies mine.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks very much, Fran. We have run out of time now, comrades, so we are going to have to finish our live event for this evening. I just want to start off by giving a huge thank you to all of the members and activists who have either put comments in the chat or sent in questions that we've been able to field. As I said a little bit earlier on, there are a large number of questions that we've not been able to get to, some of which were group specific, but a note has been made of all those questions, and we'll work with the comms team to make sure that we try and answer as many of them in the coming days and weeks as we possibly can. A huge thank you, as ever, to Richard, our BSL interpreter, for the brilliant work and job that he does on behalf of PCS and our members. Obviously, to you, Fran, thank you very much. Your first live event as the General Secretary in terms of Facebook Live and the like. So thanks very much for fielding all of those questions. And really just a reminder, please keep sharing this on the various platforms and social media channels that you have. If you have a social media account, please keep sharing it to get as wide a coverage as we can, so any members who weren't able to join us tonight can still catch up. It will be still on the PCS Facebook page as well. And just a reminder really as well that tomorrow the consultation starts with members, so keep an eye out in your inbox. Make sure if you have a registered email address with PCS that you look out for that consultation and you take part in that consultation. The bigger the turnout, the more we know our members are engaged, and the decision for the NEC will become all that much clearer and easier in March. If you know that there are any people who are in your workplace who are not members of PCS, now really is the time to encourage them to join, to make sure that they can take part, not only in this next few weeks and attend meetings, etc., but if we do move to a statutory ballot again, it hopefully goes without saying that the bigger we are, the stronger we are, and the bigger the mandate we get, the more likely we are to be successful in our demands. And to all reps and activists, if you haven't done as yet, please consider arranging members' meetings throughout this next fortnight, encouraging members to take part in the consultation, and then we'll be back in touch once the NEC's made its further decisions at the beginning of March. So thank you all for attending tonight. Thanks for your participation and solidarity.